Hello and welcome to the Racing News 365.com podcast from Racing News 365 HQ here in Eindhoven. My name is Nick Golding and I'm joined by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year and F1 writer Sam Coop, and as always, lead editor Ian Parks. This is your preview for this weekend's Japanese Grand Prix, the first of which to not take place in autumn. Gentlemen, it's Suzuka time, one of the best races on the calendar, a driver favourite. Ian, is this now a jewel of the calendar?
I would suggest it's certainly up there. As you've mentioned, it's one of the drivers' favourites without a shadow of a doubt, simply because it's one of the most iconic tracks that lends itself as well to being one of those circuits that a simple mistake, an error, and it proves costly. And that's what I love about this type of track, that we still have this on the calendar. There's been so many safety improvements over the course of the years as new tracks have been introduced. Huge runoff areas, swathes of tarmac, and let's face it, it doesn't look good. But with Suzuka, as I said, as soon as you make that first small mistake, you put a tyre on the grass, you put a tyre on the gravel, you're going to pay for it. And that, I think, is why the drivers love it as well, because they know they've got to be millimetre perfect, pretty much like many a street circuit. And that's what I think lends itself to being such a wonderful Grand Prix.
Sam, this is your first RN365 podcast. What do you think of our studio? I'll be honest, it's not always this luxurious. The perks have been at the HQ. Are you looking forward to this weekend? Suzuka.
I really am. I think one of the things that's been talked a lot about in the run-up is how, given that it was late on the calendar, as you mentioned last year, it's a really good barometer for the teams as to what they've done over the winter, how they've improved. So I think it will be a benchmark for everyone to kind of really see where the order is.
Before continuing with this podcast, fancy winning some F1 merchandise? Over here at RacingNews365.com, we are doing a merchandise giveaway where you can win either Ferrari or Red Bull merchandise if you're subscribed to the RacingNews365.com YouTube channel. The competition ends following the Japanese Grand Prix on Sunday, where a winner will then be selected by random. So what are you doing? Subscribe to the channel. And of course, going into this weekend, the big story, well, one of the big stories from Australia was Max Verstappen retiring from the race in fiery fashion, to say the least. He's obviously got a very good track record in Suzuka. It's won the last two races, something that's not been achieved since Michael Schumacher. Can he go 3 in a row this weekend in Japan? Ian, come on.
Good start initially, Nick.
Thank
I like
you very
that.
much.
You've clearly done your research.
I have done my research. I'm going to thank F1 writer Fergal Walsh, who has found the facts for me, so I'm not going to take the credit.
And me.
And you, okay.
What
all
credit
right.
do you need on this?
Well, I helped Fergal.
Oh, well, that's all right. Give yourself a pat on the back.
Okay, I'll be quiet. Ian, though, come on. Red Bull got some pressure this weekend, obviously. It didn't go to plan in Australia. They need to bounce back this weekend because Ferrari are hot on their tails.
They've not done too badly, Ferrari, to start this season. That's clearly one of the main points that I think has emerged from these first 3 Grand Prix, that Ferrari has made most definitely a step forward with its car, most definitely a step forward with its tyre management. And that's allowed them to be in the hunt. Certainly in qualifying, they've put a lot of pressure on Red Bull in that perspective. And we know from what technical director Pierre Vacher has said in an exclusive interview with one of our Dutch colleagues, Aaron Dekkers, give some credit to him, that Red Bull simply are not happy with their qualifying pace. Yet they've been on pole for the 3 Grand Prix that we've had so far. You've got to make it 4 by the looks of it. Without a shadow of a doubt, I think it's going to be 4. I think they've just got too much of an edge. Ferrari most definitely are going to run them close. I think McLaren, that's going to be a big one for us to look at. We know they did well at that circuit last year with the MCL 60. What are they going to do with that car this year? Can they run them close again? So that's going to be an interesting one to look at. But overall, we know what that RB20 is like. Every time we've had a Grand Prix, we've heard somebody say, it's a rocket ship. For Red Bull, that was a rare mechanical error with the rear brake system on that car, that it locked onto the hub and basically didn't let go, and that was the problem. Those were the problems that Max was experiencing with that car and led to his early retirement. You can't see it being 2 in a row in terms of mistake.
You never know. It's Formula 1.
You never know. It is Formula 1.
And Suzuka.
From the perfectionists that Red Bull are, I can't see it being 2 in a row. I can see it being a really close run thing, but I think that circuit really lends itself to the RB20. So without a shadow of a doubt, Max, Red Bull, okay, it's an obvious thing to say, is going to be the team to beat again this weekend.
Sam, Max's retirement obviously allowed Carlos Sainz, who was in the lead before the retirement, I will add, to claim a famous victory just 16 days after undergoing a serious surgery for appendicitis. He's got the confidence, the momentum behind him. He still needs a seat for next season. Is he the driver who is most likely the biggest threat for Max? Or, like Ian said, McLaren were very, very strong here last season. Where do you think Max, Sergio, Christian Horner are going to be looking for their biggest threat this weekend?
I mean, it's certainly within those two teams. I think part of the strength that Ian spoke to at Ferrari is that Carlos Sainz, whether or not you think he has a point to prove or whether he's already proved that and it's just a case of finding his next home, he has really taken the fight to Charles on Saturday, much more than we've seen in the past. He's looked very, very quick in qualifying and he's converting that through race pace as well. So he's looked fantastic in the 2 races that he has competed in. And so I think Ferrari are looking like a very strong unit. But again, you can't discount McLaren. They were very strong at Suzuka last year. Oscar Piastri has also taken a step forward. We've already seen that so far. So yeah, they are 2 teams that they're probably at the moment the 2 strongest driver alliance on the calendar. So yeah, on the grids rather. So yeah, it's going to be a potentially quite a hardly fought battle between McLaren and Ferrari.
We have to talk about Mercedes because they've had a shocker start to the season. When you look at Suzuka last season, they spent more time battling one another than they did the rest of the grids. Is there any hope for Mercedes this weekend to try and compete with McLaren, Red Bull and Ferrari? Or is their fight, Ian, again going to be simply trying to beat Aston Martin?
Unless they brought any updates to that car.
Well.
And we know that there is the possibility. Teams are working super hard this season to bring upgrades because they know they've only got this season to introduce them, predominantly going into next season when the cars are mostly going to be the same. So they're fighting tooth and nail to get updates as quickly as possible. Ordinarily, as we well know, teams wait until the first European Grand Prix. That's always been the case. I think this year it's a hell of a lot different. So as I mentioned, unless there's anything new on that W15, then I think it could be another whole world of pain for Mercedes in Japan this weekend.
Something yourself and myself spoke about recently on one of our F1 update videos is how all the teams are pushing so hard to introduce new parts to be as competitive as possible. But in doing so, that not necessarily forgetting, but then not having the resources to build spare parts. We saw in Australia, Logan Sargent obviously was withdrawn from the race so that Alex Albon could take his spare tub. Sam, do you think we're going to start seeing teams perhaps at a circuit as unpredictable and, accident prone as Suzuka? We might see some of the lower teams almost playing it safe to avoid potentially finding himself in the horrible situation that Williams found themselves in, Albert Park.
Potentially. I think it's maybe harsh on some of the teams around Williams to paint them with the same brush, given the lack of resources. I think lack of preparations may be harsh on Williams' part, but they didn't have a spare chassis. So I think what will be interesting is watching Williams this weekend, and particularly Alex Albon. Wreck one car and have to rotate your teammates once, do it twice. That doesn't look good. It's almost as if Logan has a bit of a free hit in that sense, and we saw him crash quite heavily at Suzuka last season. So hopefully he's going to come back better this time round. But yeah, I think it's always a concern for those lower teams, that the Hasses of the world. But I think ultimately this is a very unique situation for Williams at the moment.
I was going to say I was just going to reference Logan as well and what happened to him at Suzuka last year. You've got 2 drivers going into this weekend's race now that are going to be arguably a little bit cautious. Alex will have his incident in mind in Melbourne. Logan's going to have his incident from Suzuka last year in mind. And they know as well that there's no spare tub, as you discussed. How do they play it? a racing driver is meant to go into a weekend free of all these things that might be going on in the back of their mind that could just potentially put them a little bit on the back foot, a little bit more cautious.
And I mean, not only that for Logan, he has to rebuild his confidence after, and there are degrees to this. There's two school of thoughts. Does it show that there's no confidence in Logan Sargent, or is it just that there's less than there is in Alex Albon? Take whichever side you want, but he will have to rebuild himself up after what happened in Australia, and I think Williams will have to show their faith in him, and he'll need to see that. And so that's going to be definitely a theme of the weekend: is how will he adapt to what happened in Australia, and how can he move forward from here?
We speak about their caution, confidence, two words which I think are going to be surrounding a certain Daniel Ricciardo. Ian, we spoke about in our most recent F1 update video, a special midweek one, may I add, again in HQ. Please go check it out. We spoke about, got to plug it, we spoke about how obviously Ricciardo is being replaced in free practice 1 by Red Bull Junior Ayumu Iwasa, who competes in Super Formula, formerly in Formula 2. It's going to be a tough weekend for him. He's got the pressure on him anyway to deliver, based on obviously some of the rumours we discussed as well. How do you think his mindset is going to be going to this weekend, which is a very confident-based circuit? For those who lack confidence tend to struggle. Is this almost Is this one of the biggest weekends in Ricciardo's F1 career to an extent?
It could be a make or breaking point for him in many respects. As you've just alluded to there, and I'm just going to give reference as well to a wonderful feature that my colleague next to me, Sam, wrote regarding the Ricciardo confidence. We saw what happened at McLaren. He was a driver there that the longer it went on, the longer he was unable to get on top of what he needed to make that car go well, the more it affected his confidence. And he's admitted himself that the bottom line is, when he eventually left McLaren, he didn't know what way to turn. He was so bereft that it took his move to Red Bull to finally pick him up. We saw something of the old Daniel Ricciardo last season. We saw it in the test that took place, the Pirelli tyre test at Silverstone, a few days after the British Grand Prix. Performed wonderfully there, and that's what eventually got him that seat in the car last year at AlphaTauri. He then performed reasonably well at 2 or 3 of the Grand Prix, given the restrictions of that car last year in that AlphaTauri. And he was by far a happier driver again. We saw, to a certain extent, a lot of the old Daniel Ricciardo that had been missing at McLaren without a shadow of a doubt. And all of a sudden, the belief that he was coming out of last season into this one, that things were going to steadily improve. He was talking himself up about wanting to join Red Bull, that this was, or rejoin Red Bull, should I say. This was his opportunity again. And after 3 Grand Prix, we are now talking more about, is Daniel Ricciardo going to leave RB more than going to Red Bull? So this is a massive weekend, compromised by the fact he's now not going to be in first practice. So he's got a lot of work to fit in what is a circuit where you've got to be confident. A lot of work to fit in FP2 and FP3, going into quali and then the race. And he's got a lot to prove as well, going up against a teammate in Yuki on home soil, who's going to be wanting to put on a show for his own fans. It's a massive weekend for Daniel Ricciardo, that's for sure.
Well, it's fascinating how quickly the dynamic and the storyline has changed with Ricciardo, because the whole thing going into the season was, this is his time to shine, to show that he deserves Sergio Perez's seat and that famous Red Bull reunion. But now you look on the other side of the garage at Yuki Tsunoda, who is high on confidence, finished P7 in Australia. Sam, he's coming into his home Grand Prix. He's already said that he wants to be considered by Red Bull. He almost feels like he deserves that spot. Is this the best we've ever seen Yuki perform in F1?
I think so. I think he started last season pretty strong as well, given, again, how bad that AlphaTauri was, at least in the early stages of 2023. He has stepped up since Pierre Gasly has left. He's had a couple of 2-3 teammates, and he has moved into that leadership role, which when Nick de Vries was coming in, Helmut Marko, Red Bull, they basically placed that at de Vries' feet, and he just couldn't do it. Yuki stepped up, and he's doing so again here, having almost not been asked. And the fact that he's had to come out and say, I want to be in the running for the Red Bull seat, is telling of how he's maybe been treated or the regard within the team. Surely that should be a given. He's there in what was the kind of junior team. Why wouldn't he be considered for the seat? So he's been overlooked time and time again. It's going to be the thing that he's going to have to take if he wants it. And that's why you're starting to see him take those steps in his performance.
An interesting question, and for those watching, please comment below your thoughts on what I'm about to say. But Sam and Ian, do you think, given the way the season started, and yes, it's very early days, it is a record-breaking season, as we've spoken about, Ian and myself, quite a few times, are Red Bull going to consider a driver from within their family, or do you think they are going to look beyond at the likes of, for example, Carlos Sainz over Ricciardo or Tsunoda or Liam Lawson? Ian, we'll come to you first.
They're going to want the best driver possible in that second seat. Checo's done a good job. We've discussed Checo in the past. He's been a very solid number 2 driver. And let's face it, that's what he has become. Whilst he might always go into a season with Grand Prix winning aspirations, with title winning aspirations, as we saw last year, they very quickly floundered. He was another driver last year that got hit by a lack of confidence. The one incident in Monaco undermined him when he crashed, and then the Miami Grand Prix as well that preceded that, when he was on pole position. Max was on 9th. Max goes and wins the Grand Prix. That will have shook him to his core, that he had a great opportunity there going into that Grand Prix to reclaim the lead of the Drivers' Championship. And in many respects, he blew it. And after the crash in Monaco in particular that I just mentioned, he was never the same driver after that. It took him an awful long time to regain the confidence, to regain the composure that he required with that RB19 that Max just blew both Checo and the rest of the field away with last year. He's coming to this season now with what he would have hoped would be a car more aligned to him, bearing in mind what they would have learned at the RB19. And all of a sudden, Red Bull unveiled a very different looking car, as we now know, with that RB20. And now he's having to try and find his feet again in this car that Max has just picked up and run with, as we've seen so far, despite the incident in Australia. Not his fault, mechanical failure, things happen. And now Checo is trying basically now to fight for his seat again against drivers that he knows desperately want to be in his position next season. We've got Yuki, we've just discussed him. We've got Carlos. Fernando Alonso has been mentioned as well. You would assume, without a shadow of a doubt, he would love even just that one season in that Red Bull to go up against Max, because he knows, he will have seen, it's a Grand Prix winning car. More than likely, it's going to be a title winning car as well this season. Aston Martin have done a grand job so far, make no bones about that. Really good performance over them in trying to build themselves up, trying to get these Grand Prix wins, trying to push themselves towards the front of the grid to be a championship contender. But Fernando knows it's not quite there yet. So is next season the one opportunity he has got to get rid of this monkey off his back with regard this next Grand Prix win and potentially become a 3-time title winner, which we know he's desperate to do before he finally retires. It could be that 2025, if he's at Red Bull, will be that year.
Sam, your thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, with Sergio Perez, not to mix metaphors, last season, he almost flew too close to the sun, and in doing so kind of poked the bear in Max Verstappen.
I like
that start of the season, a couple of race wins, obviously Saudi Arabia was not Max's fault, but he beat him pretty much fair and square in Baku. And then it's, very soon after that, you see Miami. It's almost like Max has kind of sat forward and gone, right, no, I can't let that happen.
From P9 on the grid as well.
Exactly. And from then, as Ian said, it just, it wasn't even a contest. So for Perez, I think it's a case, I think he now knows his role. I think it's a case of taking race wins when he can. And the question as to whether or not he'd stay in a seat, He looked pretty good in the first 2 rounds. Obviously, qualifying has been an issue for him for getting on for a year now, and that doesn't seem to be getting better. There is that delta between him and Max, but he was working forward in the races. He was doing what he needed to do he came home P2. Australia was a bit of a different story. Red Bull say there was damage on the car, so I think Japan will be critical for Perez. As for the other, potential drivers that Red Bull could draw upon, there's lots of rumours about Max potentially leaving. If he does, I think it becomes a whole other conversation. At that point, does say a Lando Norris go, actually, I might like a go at this. Could he try and buy that contract out of McLaren?
That's a hefty contract to buy out.
That's a lot of money they're going to have to fork out for that.
Oh, absolutely. But they would be looking for their next lead driver. Sergio Perez isn't that, and yet again, Fernando Alonso would be absolutely. So and I mean the Carlos Sainz situation is intriguing. The history that him and Max have, ancient history, but Carlos will probably feel that he never quite got a fair go at Red Bull, Toro Rosso, alongside Max, and that history has maybe misremembered their time as teammates together. So, I mean, that could be an intriguing narrative in itself.
It's so interesting that we have a Mercedes seat available for next year, a Red Bull seat available for next year. For those watching, let us know who you think deserves the seats, but also who you think the teams will ultimately go for. Now, the Japanese Grand Prix, it's a driver favourite, it's a fan favourite. However, this weekend it is a sad one because whilst it's not 10 years, because obviously this is the first Japanese Grand Prix to take place outside of autumn, this is the 10th Japanese Grand Prix since Jules Bianchi's horrific accident, which in many ways has changed Formula One. Ian, as someone who has been in the paddock for several years, a few words on Jules and what is a sad weekend for motorsport.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it was 10 years ago, well, 9.5, as we know, because of the difference in the calendar this year. As we mentioned at the top of the show, Japanese Grand Prix has always been in the autumn. This year we've got the spring. F1's tried to shuffle the calendar to make it a bit more environmentally friendly with all the flights and what have you. But yeah, Jules Bianchi, I remember that season in particular. Bizarrely, that was one of the very few Grand Prix that I missed that season. I decided I wasn't going to go to Japan, but I watched it on television, and you knew it was horrific from the fact that images were not being shown as to the position of the car, as to where it was in relation to what we now know was the removal tractor that had made its way close to the circuit. It's just one of those that when you look back on Jules, we know that there was an enormous talent there just waiting to be unleashed with the right seat. I was obviously building himself up in terms of his career by being at Marussia, and the feeling was at the time that he was ultimately destined at whatever given point to drive for Ferrari. Sadly, very, very sadly, we will never know just what he might have achieved. But yes, I'm sure he will be remembered this coming weekend.
And of course, his loss was so sad and horrible for the sport. But as we often see with these tragic events, safety has been improved since then, Sam. A few words on, where F1 is nowadays compared to, 10 years ago in terms of, the safety of the cars and how, touch wood, the likelihood of having a similar accident like that has been reduced so much by the fantastic work by the FIA to make Formula One as safe as it possibly can, and the safest it has ever been.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. The safety aspect is the silver lining of what is a very dark cloud. And the fact that Formula One is able to keep on moving forward with safety every time that there has been a fatality or a serious injury, we've got to a point where we thought, it can't get much safer than this, and yet they still find a way to improve things. And so for Jules Bianchi, a big part of his legacy is tied to the halo, or in other forms of motorsport, the visor shield. And I think that's really, a positive thing, that something good could come out of such a tragedy. I think the halo has been incredibly important for Formula One. I think we look back now at some of the kind of conversations around the time, it looked really ugly, and kind of the sighting of the drivers. I mean, it almost looks silly now, those kind of comments and that way of thinking. It seems kind of primitive. The halo has been incredibly important, and again, we saw, in 2022, the British Grand Prix with Zhou Guanyu and his accident.
What an example.
And you had, people turning around saying, I didn't realise that the roll hoop could cave in on itself in that way. And so more safety improvements, were made there. Thankfully, it didn't mean, losing a life in the process. But it's a continual improvement.
Just a point on that as well with regard to the halo. I remember when, obviously, it had been produced, and it was at a pre-season test at Barcelona's Circuit de Catalunya, and Ferrari had basically been one of the pioneers in producing it, and they came into the media centre and they brought this very first halo effectively into the media centre, obviously completely unattached to the car, laid it on the floor for us all to look at, and you looked at it and you thought, what on earth is that? Are you serious? That's going to go on a Formula One car? No way, that's never going to happen. And that was the general perspective of all the media at that particular point in time, as we looked at this metal object that was going to be attached to these wonderful Formula One cars that we'd seen over the years. But lo and behold, over a period of time, it's been finessed and it's been wonderfully developed. And we now have this fantastic structure, life-saving structure. Just think go back to 2021, Monza. Max and Lewis's incident there, where Max's car landed on top of Lewis's Mercedes. Max's Red Bull landed on top of Lewis's Mercedes. I remember the rear tyre hitting the halo. And it was a case of, but for that, what on earth would have happened to Lewis? Just, as I say, from the very outset, tragedy what happened to Jules Bianchi, quite obviously. But thankfully, something wonderful has come from it. And in many respects, you could say that's part of his legacy, that's what he's given to Formula One.
Well, I think, Sam, you summed it up perfectly. The way Formula One has developed in terms of safety is, the silver lining over what is the darkest of clouds. And of course, Bianchi was a fabulous and talented driver. Going on to the final talking point, it's Japan, one of the most unpredictable of races. So with that in mind, Sam, we'll come to you first. A bold prediction, please, for the weekend.
And you can't choose mine because we've already discussed it pre-show.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I won't. Bold prediction for the weekend, I think Logan Sargeant will outperform Alex Albon.
That's bold.
I think points are maybe a little bit far, given that we know how strong the top 5 teams are this year. But yeah, I think he'll come back swinging.
On what basis? I'm going to ask you on what basis.
On what basis I think he'll outperform?
Yeah, go for it.
I think Albon will rightly be slightly hesitant, as we've already discussed. And I think Logan will know that this is the biggest test of his career so far, and he needs to show his mettle.
Ian, I know what yours is, but come on, tell the viewers.
Yeah, we did briefly discuss this just before we came on air, folks. So I'm actually going for a Daniel Ricciardo point scoring position. The reason being is I think he's got so much to prove. He will know that. And while he will undoubtedly have tried to do what he could to shut out the noise this past week or so, he will have heard about the rumours about Liam Lawson potentially getting that drive in 2 Grand Prix time if he doesn't perform. I think he's going to step it up. I really do. He knows he's got to be on it. And even though he is going to miss that FP1, he's going to come out all guns blazing. At least that's what I hope, because I'm sure for many neutral motorsport fans out there, F1 fans, they're going to want to see a performing Daniel Ricciardo.
So a common theme of drivers with the point to prove.
Well, I guess this then comes to my prediction. And as we have learnt over the F1 updates, I have the boldest of predictions, which often don't come true. So with that in mind, given the current forecast is a lot of rain, it's Suzuka. That will probably change. We're now going to have bright sunshine and blue skies after I've said this. A lower midfield team are going to finish on the podium. I don't know who. That would be too bold to the point it wouldn't be worth putting in the podcast. But a lower midfield team for a shock podium. I will happily take that.
I think a P8 would be a shock finish for a
nobody thought
team.
that Haas would get a double points finish in Australia. You know, myself and Ian ahead of the season spoke about how they're doomed this year, and yet actually they're probably the second best performing lower midfield team.
Yeah,
gentlemen, amazing podcast. For those watching, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. From the Racing News 365 HQ, we will see you next time. Bye.